From Global's newsroom at 8 o'clock, the holiday islands of Ibiza, Majorca and Menorca are being moved back to the amber travel list for England, Scotland and Wales from Monday morning. Anyone who hasn't been double jabbed for coronavirus will have to quarantine when they come back. Here's the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps.
I think we all know by now that travelling at the moment is not the same as it was before there was a global pandemic, and it does mean that when people book, particularly if you're booking to a green watch list country, you need to make sure you can get your money back. You need to make sure you can rebook your accommodation whenever required.
6 Labour-elected regional mayors have called on the government to continue to make face coverings compulsory on all public transport beyond the lifting of coronavirus restrictions in England next week. The government is planning to effectively end all prosecutions related to the Northern Ireland Troubles. The decision has been opposed by all 5 of the main political parties at Stormont. England footballer Jadon Sancho says the racism faced by players on social media is nothing new, but as a society we need to do better. He was one of those targeted following Sunday's Euro 2020 final. John Lewis is planning to cut 1,000 jobs in its department stores and Waitrose supermarkets. The move is part of a simplification of store management. In the city, the FTSE 100 closed down 33 points at 70.31. The pound buys $1.38 and €1.17. LBC weather, clear spells for many areas overnight, though low cloud affecting some coasts of eastern England, a low of 14 Celsius. Tomorrow, morning low cloud lifting and breaking to allow plenty of warm sunshine across many parts, a high of 25 degrees. From Global's newsroom for LBC, I'm Andy Ivy.
This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation. Cross Question with Iain Dale.
Hello, very good evening to you. It's 3 minutes past 8 on LBC. Welcome to Wednesday's edition of Cross Question. I'm Iain Dale. Joining me on the panel today, we have Charlotte Nichols, the Labour MP for Warrington North, also Shadow Minister for Women and Equalities. Sunder Katwala is Director of British Future. Chris Skidmore is Conservative MP for Kingswood and former Universities Minister. And Mark Wallace, Executive Editor of ConservativeHome. They're here to take your calls, 0345 6060 973 if you'd like to put a question to them. And of course, don't forget, watch us on Global Player, on the LBC website at lbc.co.uk or the LBC YouTube, Twitter or Facebook channels.
Call 0345 6060 973. Tweet at LBC. Text 84850. Cross Question with Iain Dale. This is LBC.
Well, welcome to you all. Let's go to our first question straight away. It's Gloria in Wallington. Hi, Gloria. What would you like to ask?
My question is, why do you think the Prime Minister still did not answer the question that was asked by the Labour leader? Why did he not condemn the booing of the fans at the England football match on Sunday?
I was there. I don't remember a lot of booing at that particular one. He was condemned for not condemning the booing in the first couple of matches. Sunder Katwala.
I think the Prime Minister and the government, found this one very difficult when there was quite an easy question. There might be a difficult question, what do you think about people taking the knee? When it's, what do you think about fans booing our team when they have an anti-racism gesture? I think that's quite easy. You say, I want people to support England, not boo them. We're all against racism. Some of us might do it differently. That's their choice. Let's get behind England. I would have thought that's the sort of thing you do. I think the Conservatives misread the situation. I think it was a divisive debate to some extent. We should all be against racism, but the anti-racism protests of last year have been received differently by people from different ethnic backgrounds, different ages, different generations, different politics. And so while young Labour supporters will be very in favour of it, young people generally will be very in favour of it, the Conservative audience will be a bit mixed. And so you might have some people saying, why don't they choose something more unifying? This is what the players chose. They're a bunch of people playing for England. Their average age is 25. They represent their generation. They're the only young black people in society who get a public platform of that process. And I think what the players wanted to say was, they inherit a lot of progress on racism. There's more to do. And the reason there's more to do is they face an outsized share of the racism that's left in our society, because every bigot in Britain is one click away from famous footballers, politicians. And so actually we've made loads of progress on racism in this society in my lifetime. Across generations, it's been really profound. But personally, I receive more racism now than I did 30 years ago because of social media and Twitter. Even though there's less racism in my society, I don't hear the sort of racism I heard at Goodison Park in Everton. My kids won't hear that, but I get more racism today, and the players get tons of racism because they're famous. So for young Black and Asian people in this country, it's very hard for me to say it's not as bad as it was, because they're saying, well, I live in 2020, 2021, was born here, don't want to live in a society of racist abuse. So the Prime Minister, I think, should be saying, let's stand up together against racism. Well done, the team. We've got different views about how to do it, but let's get behind them. So I think, they've moved on the argument, the players, by playing well, by standing their ground, by taking a knee. But I think this was a lesson. It was a bad month for culture warriors, and this is a lesson in don't fight culture wars of that kind.
There's a new group called Conservatives Against Racism for Equality. We had their representative on the programme last night, and he was making a big deal of the fact that Steve Baker, who's considered to be on the right of the Conservative Party, has sent a message to his group, and indeed I think to Conservative MPs, saying, look guys, I think a lot of people in the Conservative Party have misread this one, and we should admit it. What did you make of that?
I think it's brilliant that Steve Baker's done that. I think it's really good that he's done it. He's associated with the Brexit right of the Conservative Party, but he's a sort of liberal Brexiteer of his era, so he won't be the same as, somebody who had, Brexit views in the Enoch Powell era. And, he represents a diverse constituency in the south of England. And so I suppose he's saying to the Conservative Party as well, there's a value and a principle here, but there might be some short-term advantage in sort of a culture war that has 35% over there and 35% over there if, older people vote and younger people are too clustered in the cities. But actually the generational rift in our politics is very profound, and actually nobody under 40 can understand why you're really anxious or worried or wondering if you're supporting people booing. And so I think in a lot of constituencies in the south of England, especially more diverse constituencies, Conservatives need to bridge there. Okay. You can worry about sort of so-called woke politics if some student group somewhere's doing something mad, but don't worry about the England team standing up against racism. So I think it's really great he's taking that argument on in his party.
Mark Wallace, your website has its finger on the pulse of the Conservative Party membership. Do you feel that the leadership, Boris Johnson and Priti Patel in particular, have made a very bad misjudgment on this?
Well, I think people have got themselves into clearly a bit of a mess about it. But what concerns me a little bit more is that we have this political culture in which we're kind of all taught and expected and led to believe that the worst thing you could kind of possibly do is say, you know what, I've actually changed my mind about that, or maybe I was wrong about it. And if you look at what's happening, you look at some Sunder's polling, and for example, that he shares online, you see that fans, even those fans who were ambivalent or confused or even anti the question of say taking the knee at the start of this tournament, when I think there are reasons for some people to not necessarily be aware in the UK context of exactly what it was about, and there are various different competing claims. They've listened to the players saying, this is what we mean by it, this is why we do it. Listen to Gareth Southgate talking about it, and people have changed their minds. The polling has changed, just in terms of that minority who said they were, for example, against. That shrunk because for the good reason that people have listened. And I don't think it would be wrong for people in politics to do the same thing. I think most people would understand that.
And that letter from Gareth Southgate, I think that was a little bit of a turning point for some people, where he tried to explain why the players were doing it. Charlotte Nichols, how do you view this? Because obviously Keir Starmer was having a right old go at Boris Johnson at PMQs today, for understandable reasons in many ways. What would your message be to the government on this? And do you think that they have completely misread it? And how do you react to what Steve Baker's been saying?
I think that the England team have really taught the government something about leadership. The fact that public opinion has changed and softened towards the position that the England team were taking, the very positive stance that they were taking, standing up not only against racism, but standing up for LGBT inclusion, for example, which is a really powerful message in sport at a time where we don't have any out football players in the Premier League, for example. That's a really bold, inclusive vision of what Britain could be. And I think the fact that the team did as well as they did in the tournament put paid to some of these arguments that you saw being furthered, particularly by people in the Conservative Party, that, you know, the players were more interested in playing politics than they were in playing football. Now, obviously, there's an argument that, you know, Rashford wouldn't have to be feeding the kids if the government were doing it. But it's the fact that the government seemed to be led by some of the opinion polls or commentariat pieces around some of these culture war issues.
Never do that, Charlotte.
But actually, I think it's the weather vanes and signposts argument. You know, the government, you know, they are leaders. They have, they're not just there to follow public opinion, they're there to shape it. And particularly when it comes to issues around building that more diverse, inclusive society where everyone is able to play their part regardless of their race, their gender, their sexuality. You know, the government can't just be pandering to, you know, this kind of culture war narrative that they've imported from the United States, and which even in the United States they've moved away from with the election of Biden.
What about Gordon Brown, British jobs for British workers? If a Conservative Prime Minister said that now, you'd be jumping down their throats saying that was part of a culture war, wouldn't you? And all governments have focus groups. All governments follow public opinion. I mean, you'd hope that they would lead it most of the time, but all governments follow it too, don't they? Let's be honest.
Oh, for sure, but it's the balance of the two things. I think that on any issue, it's about meeting the public where they are. And certainly we've seen with the kind of bend towards social justice that we've seen over the last 30 years or so, you know, the progress that we've made, not only in terms of race equality, but in gender equality, in LGBT equality. You know, sometimes we had to start smaller to get people to that place. You know, we talk about things like civil partnerships, for example. We couldn't have introduced equal marriage when Labour was in government because certainly Parliament wasn't there, but I don't think the public was either. But civil partnerships was a way of bringing us to a point in society, leading that conversation, that debate, and getting us to a place where we could move to a more progressive future. And I think it's very difficult and dangerous for, as I said, the government to pander sometimes to some of those less progressive forces, because it's easy to do for this week or next week because it saves you getting a bad headline or having to have a difficult conversation. But as leaders, that's what they need to be doing.
Chris Skidmore, do you agree with Charlotte on that? That maybe here is a time when there was an opportunity for both the Home Secretary and the Prime Minister to provide leadership, and they just haven't done that, and they're now playing catch-up?
I think Charlotte's right in saying that public opinion has shifted, and I think the England team has probably sort of reclaimed the symbolism of taking the knee. You've got to remember when this was taking place earlier this year and into 2020, I think there was an overlap between the Black Lives Matter movement, more generally, after the death of George Floyd, and then the establishment of the sort of political party, Black Lives Matter, with the capital BLM, which is a sort of neo-Marxist organisation. It's nothing to do with the wider call for a greater racial equality. And so I think, I welcome now, this change that hopefully we'll see taking a knee as not being such a divisive issue. And I think probably in the past, the Home Secretary probably thought, that was endorsing a particular stance of a particular movement. And now actually it's gone mainstream. So, the times do change. And obviously it's the responsibility of politicians to adapt to those changes. And I do think Boris Johnson has adapted. Sunder mentioned the issue of social media really, taking us in a backward step on racism. And obviously Boris Johnson has called in social media organisations to talk about what changes are needed. Not only, I think, do we need to be ending the use of anonymous accounts that are spewing out racist bile, but at the same time, it's totally unacceptable that Instagram should be allowing monkey emojis after racist messages. And, the fact is that we need to be able to crack down on that content. And also, the Prime Minister has talked about changing legislation so that fans, or so-called fans, actually hooligans who turn up and chant racist slogans and are caught, are banned from those stadiums for life. And I think, we can have the symbolism. The symbolism is important. And it's, for me, a matter of respect that actually we do value that symbolism. But at the same time, we've got to have outcomes here. We've got to be able to demonstrate what's the change. And I think Boris Johnson wants to see that change.
Thank you very much. Gloria in Wallington, what do you make of what you've heard?
Well, I've heard lots of things, and I think that there's two separate issues here. The social media aspect is one thing, but the fact that our Prime Minister can't come out and condemn the booing of these fans so that the public can actually hear him say, you know what, I condemn this, it's wrong, as opposed to saying that, well, people can demonstrate or, basically show their displeasure whatever way they want. No, they can't. The other thing is with regards to this whole, who do they represent? I mean, we've got a Home Secretary that talks about gesture politics. But at the same token, this afternoon, Boris Johnson said that she has done lots and lots of things to try to eradicate racism and so on. What things has she done? I mean, she herself denounced the whole taking of the knee. And for me, she's actually saying she doesn't really understand why black...
Well, hang on. Priti Patel is a person of colour herself. But I mean, Chris Skidmore, I'll just answer Gloria's question there. What has she done to try and eradicate racism from our society?
Well, I mean, she's been involved in the racial disparity audit that we set up in government to actually highlight where instances of inequality and racial abuse have taken place. And she's also been responsible for putting more police on the street to help sort of protect against racially motivated attacks. And I think, it's important that we've got to be able to enforce the law when it comes to dealing with racism. And Priti Patel has made the investments that are needed to be able to make that take place.
Just finally, Charlotte, it is quite difficult for Labour on this, isn't it? Because you've got two of the three great offices of state are held by people of colour, and then you've got Kwasi Kwarteng, Business Secretary, Sajid Javid now Health Secretary. It's quite difficult to pin a charge of being racist on a government that has actually more people of colour in the top jobs than white people.
I think we have to be very mindful of the fact that to be, a person of colour is not one sort of monolithic experience within the UK, and that actually there are different racial disparities that exist for people in different groups. They experience racism in different ways. And just because you have a Home Secretary who comes from a British Asian background, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that she's going to have an understanding of the lived experience of someone from a Black British background just because they're both not white. I think that
she's probably got more experience, hasn't she? Because she's talked about the racism that she has suffered in her life as well, whereas you and I will never have experienced that.
Well, I mean, I experienced a certain form of racism as a Jewish person. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism is sort of part of my reality as a Member of Parliament. But you're right, there are different levels of understanding that different people have, but in the same way as I would never claim to speak for all people from, my own community, certainly I wouldn't claim to have a really fixed understanding of the experiences of others. And I think actually when we look at what this government has done, whether it's the Sewell report that said that basically there's no institutional racism in the UK, when you look at the fact that the government are coming after the Equalities Act and trying to unpick it, despite the fact that actually that's one of the best ways that you can be protected from racism in, a workplace context, in particular as a trade union officer for the 10 years before I came into Parliament. That was a piece of legislation that I relied on every day to protect people from racism in their workplaces. The fact that they're not doing equality impact assessments around a number of the measures that they've taken during the COVID pandemic, which have disproportionately affected people from Black and Asian minority ethnic backgrounds. I think that we can't just say, well, because the government has a number of high-profile figures who come from ethnic minority backgrounds, that it's a government that is necessarily for people from ethnic minority communities, because I think there are a number of ways where they are being failed by this government, including, most notably, in their experiences of being much more likely to be among the mortality figures of the COVID pandemic, and the fact that, Black women in this country are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth. These are all things which haven't been addressed by this government. We
could go into all of those for the rest of the hour, but we have got other subjects we want to cover as well. Keep your calls coming, 0345 6060 973. It's 8:20.
This is LBC.
This is
Minutes past 8. If only I could tell you about the conversation that we've been having in the studio, but we'd all be taken off the air. Right, let's go to another question. On Cross Question, our panel: Chris Skidmore, Charlotte Nichols, Sunder Katwala and Mark Wallace. Mike is in Beverley. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Iain. My question to the panel is, do they think that the government's messaging on mask wearing as of next Monday could have been any less clear?
Or even any more clear, I suppose, depending on your point of view. Mark Wallace.
Well, it's certainly changed in the last couple of weeks, if I'm completely frank, hasn't it? So, of course it could be clearer. I think there are two different things going on. The first thing is the perfectly legitimate question about what is the government actually advising. And we've heard, I don't think anyone can really pretend that we've had a completely consistent message from every representative of the government at all times in the last few weeks. The second question, which is going to be with us rather longer, is the kind of slightly more ridiculous pantomime in which people fan themselves and freak out as some of our colleagues in the media, pretending the idea that judgment or personal decision-making is a completely new concept which has just been unveiled with some crazy thought that someone's just cooked up overnight. And that element, I think, is a bit ridiculous, but they could certainly have helped to puncture it by getting the first element sorted and more consistent, straight out of the traps.
Charlotte.
I just think that it's this idea that the government is taking responsibility away from itself, again, this leadership role that we spoke about earlier, and trying to make it a matter of individual decision making. I think that all of us have a responsibility, particularly
But isn't that what they're saying?
But the problem is that if I, for example, go into a shop and I'm wearing a mask, it's not actually protecting me, it's protecting others. So if other people don't have the same courtesy and aren't wearing the mask, then I'm not protected, despite the fact that I'm trying to do the right thing. And what people need is actually a really clear and simple message from the government that, okay, the pandemic isn't going away. We are going to have to learn to live alongside it to a greater or lesser extent. But certainly on things like public transport, in shops, where those people don't have a choice not to be there because it's their job. You're putting key workers who've taken our country through this pandemic at risk to mollify some headbanger backbenchers in the Tory party who are just fuming that they don't want to wear masks around Parliament. It's appalling to me.
Well, would you just on that? Apparently, you won't have to wear a mask in Parliament, but your staff will.
And that's one of the ludicrous bits for me. It's the fact that we're obviously not employees as members of Parliament in the way that parliamentary staff are. But again, it's this thing of kind of one rule for us and another rule for everyone else. And I will certainly still be wearing a mask around the parliamentary estate, including when I'm in the chamber, in any public areas, because I think that it's a courtesy to the parliamentary staff who have worked their socks off for the last 18 months to make sure that despite everything that's happening, that our democracy is still able to function in this country and decisions can still be taken. And it's a shame that the government isn't taking the decisions that would protect not only people on the parliamentary estate by it still being something that was, mandatory, but also people in wider society.
Chris Skidmore, at some point, the government would have had to say, well, you don't have to wear masks. They've chosen to do it from next Monday, July the 19th. Everyone can argue, well, it should have been June the 21st or August the 16th or September the 3rd or whatever. Do you think that this particular measure was announced too early?
Well, I think we've got to be in a place now where we're still internationally 63-65% of the population have now been vaccinated. That's going to be sort of by the August have reached a higher figure, maybe 80%, and there will come a point where we're going to have to transition across to living with COVID, as Sajid Javid has stated. We have an increasing case rate. Was it 45,000 now, the same rate as it was on the 14th of January? Yet the link between that and death seems to have been broken. And we are now in a new phase, I think, where short of a new variant coming from a different country and causing a sort of a completely separate wave where vaccines work, we need to move to this stage, but I will still be wearing a mask. I want to say that, and I'll wear my mask in Parliament as I've always done. It is a mark of respect. Charlotte said you do it to protect other people, not yourself. And I'd urge all my colleagues to do so. I think sort of when it's a small, it's not repressive to be wearing a mask, and I will continue to wear a mask even after July the 19th.
Sunder Katwala, do you think that Sadiq Khan was right today to say that he certainly is ordering people on London Underground and on buses to keep wearing masks?
I think encouraging, advising. I mean, the way Chris has just put that there as well, that chimes with where people are. We're all in this situation together. We can take some responsibility for each other. We want to have had the vaccines. Almost all of us have decided to have them. We can handle this together, but actually what you do matters for other people. That chimes. What's interesting is it's taken the government a bit of time to flip back to that message. What surprises me about the government, they're very attuned to public opinion. They spend an awful lot of time researching it. They spend a lot of money getting it. And then on this, they keep being surprised. But they keep being surprised by the same thing, which is that the public is really quite cautious about COVID, whatever their political views. And it isn't some which side were you on Brexit. That's going on in one corner of the internet. It's going on in certain newspapers. It's going on in certain bits of politics. But actually, especially older people who obviously voted Leave very heavily, they're very cautious about it. So it surprises me that the government keeps being surprised. It isn't, Mark's done research into the Conservative membership. It's the Conservative membership as well as the parliamentary party and the newspapers are in a different place, have got a sort of ideological position about sort of libertarianism would be good as soon as possible. But that isn't where the government's votes are. My weather vane on this is my in-laws are among the biggest fans of the Prime Minister, so I tweet about them quite often in Billericay. They're a bit disappointed we left with a deal, not with no deal, but they're just about putting up with that. So I asked them, my father-in-law's very good at finding the best interpretation of the Prime Minister. Anyway, so my mother-in-law said, it's that, they need to be a bit careful, phase it. Obviously, you have to go back to normal. He said, the Prime Minister's right, isn't it? It's up to all of us now. Well, we'll have to look after each other. I'll be wearing a mask. And so they were both quite cautious, but managing to take the personal responsibility. But they're not in some culture war where people who wear a mask are kind of, wet and woolly sort of students somewhere and solid Brexiteers are going out for freedom without wearing a mask. That's not their view.
I think this is another great example of where Twitter does not represent real life. I stupidly took a selfie of myself at Wembley on Sunday wearing a mask. I mean, the abuse I got, it was just quite astonishing. And yet most normal people thought, well, yeah, absolutely sensible. I've just done my lateral flow test. I got it here, negative, thank goodness. Right, just to round off this half hour, we've got an email from Sarah in Barnard Castle. I never knew there were so many people in Barnard Castle. I'd never heard of it before last May. She says the PM had an article in The Independent in which he categorically said that people should not boo players for taking the knee. It's also on Guido Fawkes today, and the Speaker has also been informed. Unfortunately, the Leader of the Opposition did not get his facts right. Well, on Guido Fawkes, it says he did do an interview with Laura Koonsberg of the BBC where he did say that players should not be booed for taking the knee. So, make of that what you will. More questions in a moment. 0345 6060 973. It's 8:30. Andy Ivey has the news headlines.
Ibiza, Mallorca and Menorca are being moved back onto the amber travel list for England, Scotland and Wales from Monday, meaning people who haven't been fully vaccinated will have to self-isolate on their return. The decision has been criticised by the chief executive of EasyJet, who says rates of coronavirus in much of Europe remain lower than in the UK. The government is proposing to effectively end all prosecutions related to the Northern Ireland Troubles. The move would apply to military veterans as well as former paramilitaries and also end all legacy inquests and civil actions. A senior Metropolitan Police officer has rejected accusations the operation at Sunday's Euro 2020 final had failed after England supporters without tickets forced their way into Wembley. The force is pushing back at accusations it failed to maintain a ring of steel around the stadium. LBC weather, clear spells for many areas overnight, though low cloud affecting some coast of eastern England, a low of 14 Celsius. Tomorrow, morning low cloud lifting and breaking to allow plenty of warm sunshine across many parts, a high of 25 degrees.
All next week, LBC will be looking into the digital divide and how you can help those left behind. 44% of those affected are children. The cost of digital poverty will be with them for life. Vodafone wants to bring an end to digital exclusion and connect the nation for a better future. That's all next week. I'm Iain Dale. It's 8:32.
This is LBC.
On LBC, the Prime Minister's podcast is on Global Player as well. This week I talked to Adam Bolton about the premiership of David Cameron. It isn't pretty listening if you're David Cameron, it has to be said. Right, cross question until 9. We have with us in the studio Charlotte Nichols, Labour MP for Warrington North, Shadow Minister for Women and Equality, Sunder Katwala, Director of British Future, and joining us from the not from the LBC studio, from his home, I think, it's Mark Wallace, Executive Editor of ConservativeHome, and Chris Skidmore, Conservative MP for Kingswood, former Universities Minister. Let's go to our next question. It's from James in Watford. Hello, James.
Hello, good evening.
Hi.
Yes, Professor Stephen Riker from Independent Sage recently said we need to move away from the I towards the we, and he was talking about restrictions and face masks and things. And my question is, are the scientists and advisors moving the UK to a more collectivist mindset over an individualist one? Are they, in short, having a political influence now, and what are the repercussions of that?
Chris Skidmore, people look at Independent Sage and often think they're just a bunch of raving lefties. Do you?
Well, I think as former science minister, we have some of the best scientists in the world. The UK is internationally renowned, and as a result of having that research and development base in the UK, we were able to power ahead and develop a vaccine that's seen as world leading in this regard. Now, do I think somehow that scientists are, Dr. Strangelove style, sort of leading the UK down a dark and dangerous path? No, I don't. I think, what we've got to be clear is that scientists, don't always have the answer as scientists, and that sometimes they will be wrong, just as politicians are wrong. I think the fallacy is that sometimes, because someone's a scientist or has a professor, titles their name, that they will say something and the data may change. And I think that's very difficult for people to understand sometimes, is that the modelling that takes place is still an exact science. We're learning during the pandemic about the virus and its infectious levels and infection rates. And so therefore, we can't necessarily, besmirch scientists when things don't turn out as they planned. But at the same time, we should deeply respect their advice, because, many other countries would give their eye teeth for what we've got when it comes to our scientific level of knowledge and actually our scientific community.
Sunder.
Yeah, we haven't had enough of experts once we've got a pandemic. I think we're quite keen to hear from experts.
Even when they disagree.
And they do disagree. But, they've done some brilliant things, scientists. Obviously, they've got us a vaccine, which is, just desperately important. And they've made mistakes. And also, you have a once-in-a-century event. They're wrong about things because things haven't happened before. So they haven't actually got any data. So they're guessing, the behavioural people said, can't lock down too early because, people are only going to put up for it for a few weeks. And so they massively underestimated the sort of social cohesion and community mindedness of the public because they hadn't seen it happening before. And so we weren't all sort of rioting by the summer. So there's I don't agree with the implicit point that they've got a political view, but also they can't have one, because all they can do is say, here's this model, here's that model, we think this, we maybe think that, if you change this, it will go. And then politicians have to make actual decisions.
People are attributing political motives to some of them. I mean, Professor Susan Mickey, she was asked about her membership of the Communist Party. Now you think, well, does that have an effect on someone's scientific expertise? You'd like to think not.
I think, you've got things like, maths and data, and they all scrutinise it with each other. And then you've got social choices about what that means. Here's this level of risk. Do you want to take it or don't you want to take it? Would these be avoidable deaths or unavoidable deaths? So in the end, scientists themselves might have to do it, but you look to other people, the politicians. What I think has been important and underestimated, we're a very divided, and we're more divided and fractious society than we want to be. Actually, we've been a much more cohesive society, actually, than the scientists and the behavioural scientists and the government actually thought in terms of our behaviour around all of this in what has been a really tough time. So I think the scientists have done really well at doing their job, but actually all they can do is, give us models and data, and we've got to make decisions with our own lives and policy about it.
And Charlotte, this whole idea of collectivist activity rather than individualist, I mean, this is almost the dividing line between left and right, isn't it? The people on the left will generally take a more collectivist approach, people on the right are more individualistic. But do you think that the COVID crisis is changing that? And I mean, I noticed myself that, I believe in a small state, but I completely get that for the next 10 years, that aspiration is not, I mean, I'll probably be in my dotage before I see a small state again, because we're in a situation where government has got to have a role in getting us out of this, much more so than maybe other crises.
Certainly, and I think the coronavirus pandemic has turned a lot of economic orthodoxies on their heads. As you said, we've had what's been referred to in certain sections of the media as a kind of war communism from a government that's, in political terms, sort of fairly right-wing. You wouldn't be expecting someone like Rishi Sunak to be implementing the kind of policies that he has over the last year, were we not in the sort of very upside-down times of the pandemic. And it's right that we adjust our approach politically to deal with those, the reality of the situation that we're in, as you said. I think that scientists in particular, can certainly put aside their political beliefs to talk about things like the data. But I don't think there's anything that is not political. And certainly in a public health setting, it's right that, as I said earlier about, going into shops and things, it's not the personal responsibility that you might take when it comes to something to do with, not smoking or drinking or obesity or things like that, affects you. It's your actions actually affect others in a much more obvious way during COVID. And I think what we have actually seen is an incredible community spirit across society, certainly in communities like mine, where we've had pubs that have been closed because of the government restrictions, making sure that none of their food went to landfill, that it went to feeding hungry children and homeless people in the area, with the stuff that football clubs have been doing, rugby clubs, that schools, churches, community groups. I would hate to think that that is something that we'd leave behind as a society once we're out of the worst of this pandemic, because I think it has shown us how much we all rely on each other. And actually for people who have never been on things like universal credit before, who, due to the pandemic have perhaps lost their jobs and had to rely on that safety net for the first time, finally, maybe for the first time, seeing the benefit. And you can't actually just go, I'm all right, Jack, in modern Britain, because we do all rely on each other. And I think if we are building a bit more of a collective spirit, as possible silver lining of the horrors that have been the last year, then that's a good thing that we should take away.
Mark Wallace, this is a difficult one for the Conservative Party, isn't it, in many ways?
Yes, I mean, I think it's really interesting that one of the things to remember is that community and the state are not always the same thing. In fact, they're often in conflict. And it's definitely the case that, personally speaking, as somebody kind of with a libertarian kind of inclination and worldview, I found it quite frustrating at times in the course of the last 18 months that the traditional criticism of, say, libertarianism is that actually it's kind of arcane, kind of wordy cover for just wanting to be selfish. And what's frustrated me is that this pandemic has, in some cases, shown who that criticism is sometimes accurate about and who is perhaps an actual libertarian. I mean, if you look at a pandemic, a highly infectious disease spreading through society and around the world, injuring people, devastating the economy and taking lives, is a classic example in libertarian thought of a collective action problem. It's something where just leaving it completely down to you to decide exactly what to happen, exactly what ought to happen, is not always the appropriate solution. That's something that actually you would normally recognise. If you're a libertarian, you think about the harm principle. You try and think about how to run things on the basis that you're prevented from doing things that injure or kill other people. And pretty obviously, coughing a highly infectious pandemic virus that could kill somebody right in their proximity in a responsible way is a good example of that. And so this has been a challenge for a lot of people in a lot of different ways. I think one thing you need to think about is where there's a collective action responsibility and there is a crisis for that kind of war communism analogy that was just drawn out. Part of the question is, how do you then afterwards make sure that this doesn't become permanent? Remember, World War II, for example, a massive collective action crisis in which the state needed to take very intrusive action on individual freedom, property rights, mass nationalisation, conscription, etc. A lot of those things weren't undone for years and years. Rationing lasted until the 1950s, as did identity cards. Many of the nationalisations lasted even until the 1990s. Some are still with us today. So the question is not just how do you respond to a crisis, but actually, if you're thinking about it properly, how do you make sure you don't end up on a kind of inappropriate war footing right into peacetime, because then you are you get kind of incurring costs. The final thing, very swiftly, is Susan Michie, when she was asked about communism, got very annoyed and said, well, what matters is that I'm a scientist, I'm evidence-led. I think it's quite reasonable if you're talking about something like communism, where the evidence of history and the mass suffering and devastation it causes is well known, it's clear in the evidence. It's quite reasonable to question if somebody is evidence-led, if they can look at all that history and all that evidence and still call themselves a communist.
Well, there you go. And again, we could talk about that one for another hour, but we won't, because in a moment we're going to be talking about the decision today by the government to announce proposals on the future of legacy prosecutions in Northern Ireland. It's 8:45.
This is LBC.
Planning.
.48 on LBC. Cross Question with Chris Skidmore, Charlotte Nichols, Sunder, Katwala and Mark Wallace. We have a text question now from Mary in Belfast. Why does the British government have no interest in giving grieving families closure? Well, this of course relates to the announcement by Brandon Lewis, the Northern Ireland Secretary, in the Commons this afternoon, saying there'll be no more prosecutions on either side. Does this draw a line under the Troubles, Charlotte?
I don't think it does, and I think it's an incredibly incendiary action that the government has taken at a time when tensions are running very high in Northern Ireland around the Northern Ireland Protocol and other legacy issues there. I think certainly in my own constituency, the Warrington bombing, of course, being something that is still remembered, still really deeply felt, the hurt, the pain that's been caused there for the families involved, for the Peace Foundation, for the community in Warrington to hear today that the government are saying that there will never be a prosecution in that case. That the investigation will be effectively dropped. Everything before 1998, there'll be an amnesty for. People are rightly asking, why is the government giving an amnesty to terrorists on both sides of the sectarian conflict? Because that isn't how we achieve the truth and reconciliation that we need.
Let me put the other point of view to you, because if you look at what happened in Rwanda after the genocide there, to a certain extent also in South Africa, you do have to make uncomfortable decisions like this. And I mean, if they had just said, well, there will be no prosecutions of British soldiers, for example, I mean, that would have been, you just said this decision was incendiary. I mean, that really would have been. Do you not have to, at some stage, try to draw a line? And I wonder, I said this to one of our guests earlier in the programme, I wonder whether this is something that all of the parties have to publicly condemn, but behind the scenes, they kind of might understand the reason for it.
I don't think that is the case. I actually studied comparative peace processes at university, and I'm quite familiar with a lot of the truth. But I studied politics, but one of my modules was comparative peace processes. So I have read a lot around sort of truth and reconciliation commissions. Different conflicts that have taken place around the world, including in Guatemala, for example, is another place where amnesties of a sort were introduced as a way of bridging the gap of, bringing communities together for truth and reconciliation. But what I don't understand about the way that the government has formulated these proposals is the fact that there is not, if it's a blanket amnesty, any real incentive for anyone who was a combatant on any side of the conflict or who has acted wrongly to be honest about it, because there is an amnesty. Whereas if it was not a blanket amnesty, and you can say to people, look, if you're honest about what happened, if you'll give this grieving family some closure, conditionally we will offer you some level of amnesty, there is then an incentive there for them to be honest. I think if you give a blanket amnesty, I don't understand why people are suddenly going to come forward to admit to the things that they've done. I don't think that it gets us closer to truth and justice.
Surely it's a natural extension of what happened in the Good Friday Agreement, where people from both sides were released from prison. I remember in about 2003, 2004, standing outside this very building, and I was introduced to someone called Patrick, and I shook his hand. And I looked at him and I thought, I know you. And it was the Brighton bomber, Patrick McGee. I wanted to have a shower afterwards, I can tell you. I was so horrified that a friend of mine who was acting as his PR agent, can you believe, had done that. But, I mean, he was released from prison after 14 years, and I imagine the families of the victims of the Brighton bomb were pretty outraged at that. So what is the difference in this situation? I completely understand that the families of the victims on both sides will be quite outraged by it. I get that. But sometimes, as a government, you have to take these kind of decisions sort of for the long-term good, and that's what Tony Blair did, surely.
I think the fact of the Good Friday Agreement was the fact that
I hate to mention Tony Blair to a Labour MP.
I have no issue with you mentioning Blair. But, I think that the Good Friday Agreement, which was something which was endorsed by all of the major political parties in Northern Ireland and the island of Ireland, it was something that had been negotiated for many years. There was an extensive consultation with different victims groups and so on. That is not what has happened in this scenario. I had to ring people in my constituency who've been affected by terrorist incidents that took place before this 1998 cut-off date that they're talking about today, to let them know, because I didn't want them to find out from the press. And naturally, they were horrified. Right. I think because it's come out of nowhere, because they were not consulted, because it's something that's opposed by all of the major political parties in Northern Ireland and the Irish government, they can't understand why it's something that the British government is pursuing, and certainly not at this time.
Chris Skidmore.
Well, I think to start with, if all 5 major parties are opposing it, whether these proposals are going to fly is a different matter. And I think, we'll see what the reaction is. But I think listening to Brandon Lewis's statement to the Commons today, the question is, what outcome do you want in the end of it? Because, we've had these sort of prosecutions of soldiers that have mainly, the trials have collapsed. They've led to no justice at the end of it, whatever form of justice somebody wanted to see. And that process of reconciliation, I'll obviously bow to Charlotte's expertise, is one where the facts show that we got 3,500 people killed in the Troubles, of which 1,200 of those murders are being investigated currently by the police. It's a large number where we simply don't know any facts whatsoever, and trying to get under the skin of the history here, and before it's too late. People who were involved in Bloody Sunday 50 years ago are now in their 80s. And within several years, all these people will be dead, and with them, the truth will be buried. And that's the reality, is what is the justice people want here? Do they want to know the truth of what happened to their loved ones? Because for many people, that is the restorative justice that they deserve to have and to hear. And yet, if we continue down the path where we have been continuing, we will not get that for people. And so I can understand why Brandon Lewis is trying to come up with a solution, but the politics may mean that this is just too controversial, and we are unable to reach a point where we're able to get that restorative justice and reconciliation. But I think we do have to sort of say, what's the outcome we want to start with, rather than the sort of response, obviously, which is happened at the same time as the Good Friday agreement, one where you sort of, the initial reaction is one of shock, and actually understand why would we do this, and what is the outcome that we need to have.
Okay, Mark, let me just remind you of the question. Why does the British government have no interest in giving grieving families closure?
And it's a very good question, because this isn't just about whether peace and whether truth and reconciliation is eventually achieved or not. Effectively, what concerns me very deeply about this is that you are imposing the costs of an arrangement specifically on the people who have already paid the most, who've already borne the most severe burden of the violent extremism you see in the Troubles, as well, of course, as those instances where crimes have been committed by members of the British Armed Forces. And what happened, I'm glad you brought up the Good Friday Agreement earlier, because I still don't think we've really had a very clear and coherent answer on any side why actually, that amnesty for murdering terrorists was actually totally fine and laudable. This amnesty for murdering terrorists is completely unacceptable. I think it's very hard to square the two. And really, there is, to a certain extent, a matter of not truth and reconciliation, but a kind of civilized and fairly uniform silence in which everyone kind of says, we know what, if the prospect is that people who would otherwise be pursued for conviction are going for their crimes are going to carry on committing more crimes, then what we're going to do is we're going to ask the families of the victims, some of whom, remember, have not only not had justice, but have never found out where the bodies of their loved ones are. We're going to ask those people to continue bearing that cost forever. I find that very hard to swallow. Also, what happened to those letters of comfort? Blair didn't just do the Good Friday Agreement. He sent those, his government sent those comfort letters to people on the run saying, we're not going to chase you anymore. So this is not the only time there's been an unexplained amnesty.
Okay, Sunder.
Yeah, I think we're very neglectful of Northern Ireland. I think it's a sort of out of sight, out of mind place for the government, sometimes for the British public, actually. And I think that's why this has been done. And the British media. That's why this has been done in a sort of headline way without doing the work. So I think Charlotte, Chris and Mark's points are very powerful there. In reality, you're not going to get prosecutions. In reality, we have made a trade-off of peace and justice. But what you could do, instead of having this amnesty headline, is you could have a historical inquiries unit that just tries to find out as much information as possible, gives people as much information as possible, and proceeds on that basis. What you're trying to do, I mean, what we've seen in Warrington is absolutely fantastic, because, in the name of Jonathan Ball and Colin Parry, you've seen peace efforts. Tim Parry. You've seen efforts at peace and working on having the conversation about peace. And I think just saying there's a headline, it's an amnesty, isn't doing the work. We can't you cannot solve the injustices of the past, and you've decided to have a level of forgiveness and a level of pragmatism, but you can still find out more than the government seems to be wanting to do.
Well, we're not ignoring Northern Ireland on this programme. We never do. We've done lots of phone-ins on various issues to do with Northern Ireland, and we're going to do that again in just a couple of minutes' time, where we get your reaction to today's announcement. Particularly keen to hear from you if you live in Northern Ireland. 0345 6060 973. A final text question from Sally in Bolton, who clearly has recognised that we have one of our younger panels on the programme tonight. When restrictions ease next week, what song will get you throwing shapes in the nightclub? Who shall I come to first? Mark Wallace looks as if he would rather answer any question than this. Sunder.
Well, I was getting the kids to learn the lyrics to Three Lions. We've lost that, but I've also been teaching them Disco 2000 by Pulp. Won't it be great in 2000 when we're all fully grown? And they think, 2000 a long time ago.
I'm not familiar with that one. Charlotte?
I have to say I'm not much of a dancer, but I am partial to a bit of Shania Twain on karaoke, so maybe I'll go for that instead.
Give us a burst.
I haven't had enough pints to do it.
Mark?
By the sound of it, we're all going in for karaoke together. But my young kids have basically taken over my life to the degree to which this morning, after dropping them at school and nursery, we came home and put the Pokemon theme tune on to rock out to in our kitchen because it's a stone-cold, face-melting classic.
It is a banger, to be fair.
I have to bow to your superior knowledge of this sort of thing. Chris?
I agree with Mark on the Pokemon there. I don't feel that. I feel pretty old now. I mean, I got the AstraZeneca vaccine rather than the Pfizer, so that sort of dates me.
Yeah, me too.
Where I am on the age range. I mean, I won't be seen in a nightclub full stop now. I'm not sort of like a Matt Hancock sort of karaoke guru, but
or in any other way.
Yeah, I'm a Bob Dylan fan, so I think I'm going to choose Tangled Up in Blue, with a political theme in there as well. But much more of a folky rather than a jiver.
Well, I haven't heard of any of these, so you just can't beat Dancing Queen, I think, as a banger on the dance floor, can you? Anyway, moving swiftly on from that, we're going to be talking about Northern Ireland in a moment. 0345 6060 973. Mark Wallace, Chris Skidmore, Charlotte Nichols and Sunder Katwala, thank you very much indeed. It's 9:01.
On your radio, on Global Player, and
Play LBC.
leading Britain's conversation. This is LBC.
From Global's newsroom, Spain's Balearic Islands are being moved back to the amber travel list just 2 weeks after being on the green list. The new rules affecting Mallorca, Menorca and Ibiza take effect in England, Scotland and Wales from 4 a.m. on Monday. They coincide with the relaxation of the law on quarantining for people arriving from amber list destinations who've had both